this world is changing. The world in which we operate is changing so much. The scales are tipping and it's unclear where things go from here.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
To the Middle East now, and more than 50,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began. That's according to the territory's Hamas-run health ministry.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Monday, 5th of May, 2025. Welcome to another bank holiday edition of the show. Today I'll be chatting to some of the Telegraph's best journalists about what it's like to be a war reporter, the life of a foreign correspondent, and the challenges of covering the era-defining geopolitical shifts underway at the moment. I'm joined in the studio by defence editor Danielle Sheridan.
Hello.
Ukraine the latest host Adelie Pojzman-Pontay.
Hi, Venetia.
And joining us down the line from Istanbul, senior foreign correspondent Sophia Yan.
Hi.
Welcome to Battlelines, everyone. By way of introduction, and also just to give our listeners a peek behind the scenes of the newsroom, can you start by running us through what a typical day looks like for each of you? Danielle, do you want to kick us off?
Work starts the minute you wake up. All of my top contacts are on my personal mobile phone. So the first thing I do once I've, woken up before I read the news is literally look at my phone and see who's WhatsApped me. Quite often stuff has come in overnight, or I've sent a late night WhatsApp and then I've got a response and it's a lead, a thread to work on when I get in. I read the Telegraph, the Times, the New York Times on my phone, walk my dog, and then I come into work. Then obviously I work with the news desk, so there might be something that's really interested them and they'll be getting in touch with me and saying, we want you to follow this, put in calls on that. I speak to the MOD most days, or people within the MOD, trying to make sense of if something is a legitimate story or not. My focus is, I think, more domestic, what's going on with the British military in country as opposed to foreign aspects of it. But saying that, I do have a lot of interest in foreign reporting and I do touch base with the foreign desk throughout the day.
I guess the story of the British Army has become a European global story in a sense over the last few months, and we'll be getting into that a bit more. But I want to quickly talk about an exclusive that you had in today's paper about the Gurkhas. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how that came about?
I was able to reveal in today's newspaper that the British Army have established a new unit. It's going to be made up of Gurkhas, so Nepalese soldiers, and it will be called the King's Gurkha Artillery. It was really interesting to dip into the history of the Gurkhas. They have a relationship spanning 2 centuries, and it began with the Brits and the Gurkhas fighting against each other, only to realise that they worked better together than against one another. And since then, there's been this real long-standing relationship, and it's hugely competitive to get into the Gurkhas. I was reading this new book has come out all about the Gurkha mindset and how they are just deemed as some of the top soldiers that we have in the British Army because of their resilience, their work ethic, and just their mental capacity to keep going in the face of adversity. So it's really interesting that this is the unit that they've decided to expand. So there's going to be around 400 new troops, 1/3 of which will be new hires, and then the remaining 2/3 will come from brigades already existing in the army. But it also comes against a backdrop of a real retention and recruitment crisis within the military. It's not great, but apparently things are looking up. But for years, there's been a real problem with people not wanting to join the military across all forces, not just the army. And then also those that have joined don't want to stay because of, lack of progression, poor accommodation, strain on family life, not enough money for, the arduous tasks that they do. So this is kind of a way of showing that the army is growing.
Adelie, what does a day look like for you? A bit different, I imagine, but perhaps you also start by waking up and checking the news.
Yes, very much so. I also wake up, check the news, go across the Telegraph, pretty much the same thing you do, really.
We're news hounds. We wake up, that's our breakfast.
But also I check the Kyiv Independent and the BBC, and also the French newspaper Le Monde, which has really, really good coverage of the Ukraine war. As you hear, I am French. So always good to keep an eye on what's going on in the domestic front. But as an audio person, then the next thing I do is listen to the BBC newscast. Because how am I going to get my news if not by listening to it? So that's always very useful. My days are very different because basically my job is twofold. I'm both a narrative producer here at The Telegraph on the audio team, as well as one of the co-hosts of Ukraine the Latest. So I'm not hosting every day. When I do, it means first thing in the morning is to create the script for the day, liaise with everyone. It's Francis and Dom who are the other two co-hosts of the podcast and have been there since the very beginning, and liaise with the rest of the team, building up who's going to do the updates, what sort of interviews do we have for the day, who's joining during the live show, and just making sure it all goes out in due time, especially now that we're translating the podcast every day into Ukrainian and Russian. So that's an added layer that happens after the live show. The rest of my week usually is divided in recording interviews for Ukraine the Latest that will be added into the show, and also working on other narrative projects that happen in the newsroom on the audio desk. It can be a very long-form series like the investigation of my colleague Cara McGugan, Bed of Lies, that just got released in the last couple of months, and that Venetia, you also worked on. Also working with the Daily Tea on shorter narrative series like the Jan Marsalek story that Hayley Dixon did a couple of months ago. And then also working on long-form series for Ukraine the Latest, which is kind of like my long-form projects.
You started working semi-full-time, as you just described, on Ukraine the Latest earlier this year. How did you find being immersed in the world of daily Ukraine news? Is it overwhelming, the amount of detail that there is out there that you could pick up on, and the amount of detail that a lot of your listeners expect from you?
I did find it very overwhelming for a couple of reasons. First, because throughout my career, I've always been an audio producer, and I've often been a one-woman band doing the reporting, the producing, the scripting, and everything. But what that means is I'm often not behind the mic. I'm often kind of in the shadows. You don't hear me. Also, whenever I have done hosting in my career, it was in French and it was not in a live show. So two new things to adapt to, because I have mostly done narrative and documentary stuff in my career, happens over maybe 6 months, a year, sometimes 2 years. So time is very elastic. I've actually found it both a bit daunting, but also really nice to be able to get stuff out really quickly and to be able to balance these like long form projects with something that you can just record on the day and then it's out and you don't really need to think about it, and then you can move on to what the next bit of information is. But it's also the first time in my career where I really have a beat, so I really have a circumscribed topic to look into. And obviously the war in Ukraine is super wide, but it helps that Dom is doing more of the military stuff, that Francis is doing more of the diplomacy, politics stuff, and I'm doing more of the human stories, what we call the heart of things.
Sophia, what does your day look like?
Well, like most journalists, like Danny and Adelie, I start by reading the news. I wake up, I have coffee, and I take a look at what's happening in the world. I look at what the Telegraph's got. I look at what all our competitors have, just to have a sense of what might have happened overnight, especially if there was any major breaking news that's developing. And even if I'm not covering it, it's still important for me to be aware of what's going on everywhere in the world, to have some sense of how things might move, because I am often looking at a very high level, 30,000 foot level, big picture stories, analysis, features. So I really have to understand how different pieces all around the world fit together like a puzzle. If something happens in Ukraine, what does that mean for the US? What does that mean for Russia and China? What does that mean for Iran? You know, these are the kinds of questions I'm always thinking about when I'm looking through the news. And in terms of the projects I'm working on now, I've been investigating the organized crime behind migration. So looking at the smugglers that help move hundreds of thousands of people across borders illegally every year. Some of these people are economic migrants. Others are fleeing war, famine, persecution. I mean, they're coming from Afghanistan, Iran, Sudan, Pakistan, even China. So I've talked to smugglers from the Americas, across Europe and the Middle East, all the way to Asia. I'm looking at how people move, how the money flows, and in some cases, just tracking down the kingpins that make it all happen. And it's really tough for obvious reasons. I keep joking that our foreign editor wants me to find the folks that Interpol can't find.
I mean, yeah, that is an extraordinarily difficult beat. Your latest story was about Chinese companies selling inflatable boats for refugees online and how they're advertising them to people smugglers. That pulls in some aspects of your previous beat. You were our China correspondent for many years, and before that you were based in China and Hong Kong for CNN and CNBC. How much do you keep an eye on China?
I still follow it every day. The rise of China is one of the biggest stories in the world, and it's the story of the future. There are conflicts and concerns that are very immediate today. It's important, of course, to cover what's happening in the U.S. under Trump for a second term. Of course, Ukraine's still going, Gaza's still going. I mean, there were so many global stories that are taking our attention for journalists and for the general public. But China is this long, slow burn story, and that's something we've talked about before on Battlelines. I think it's very important to continue to understand what's happening in China, because that is the future. China's growing in power and influence, and they're so much ahead of the game in terms of technology. So understanding what's happening there is very, very important. And for me, it's something I've covered my whole career. It's something I will always be interested in.
Can you give us a brief glimpse into what your day used to be like back when you were based in Beijing?
Well, I was always under a lot of surveillance, and it was very stressful. So I had to do my best to keep as much of my plans for reporting under wraps as much as possible. It is kind of impossible, right? Because my editors are in London, and you have to have some sort of discussion. But I would often have a lot of very coded emails to try to explain what I was going to do. But often I had to just go and do it and hope for the best and then produce something, because I didn't want to give the minders that would follow me around, whether it was digitally or physically, I didn't want to give them a chance to stop my reporting before I could even start it. All the things that I did then are still things I do now, because that is the way the world is moving in terms of the hostility towards journalists from a general public sentiment. I mean, there's a lot of vitriol against the media, and then also this growing general public distrust of journalists, of what we do. I would say that the risk is becoming much more complicated, and I do worry about that in the long run. So the kinds of things I set in place to safeguard my sources and my processes as a reporter, I have continued to use them even outside of China.
I was going to say, Turkey is not exactly known for protecting journalists either. Do you feel a level of risk there too, or is it nothing compared to China?
This is really interesting about Turkey. So when I first came, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the political situation here, because it has gone through ups and downs in terms of press freedom. And the thing that I realized, which, for me was fascinating, was that Istanbul and Turkey felt like what Hong Kong was like some 15 years ago when I first arrived as a journalist. And what I mean by that is that it's a cosmopolitan city, tons of people here, super international, very exciting. But you can feel that there's something in the air politically. Things could literally fall off a cliff, or it could maybe be okay. And when I got here, I realized with Istanbul and Turkey that I was like, I've felt this before. I've seen this before. I know what this is. I think I know what this is. So it's been really interesting to observe that. And of course, Turkey has had a lot of political upheaval lately.
I want to pick up on something you said, Adelie, and that's that you read the French press every morning because you're French. One of the reasons that I think this is such a wonderful group of journalists to bring together is that you all bring very unique perspectives to your reporting. How does reading the French press inform your reporting on Ukraine? What's the different elements that brings in there that you think we might miss if we're only reading the English press here?
France has a very different recent history in terms of involvement in the war in Ukraine. It has also very specific defense history relative to NATO, relative to nuclear deterrence, but also very specific relationship to Russia. France has been a bit lukewarm in taking a stance in favor of Ukraine and against Russia since the beginning of the war. And that has rapidly changed over the last year. And it's completely radically different now with the coalition of the willing. So I think these changes have happened really, really fast. But I think the UK and France are within the same political arena, but coming with very, very different backgrounds into it. And it has been very fascinating to discover, since I moved to the UK 2.5 years ago, the kind of British position on this. I was really, really baffled, and that's probably because I was going as a quote-unquote British journalist when I went to Ukraine for the first time, is how excited people were to see British journalists, and also the number of Union Jacks that we could see across Ukraine. And I did not see the tricolour fly in many, many, many places. And that did strike me. And I think these differences that I've kind of learned as I've been reporting on this have been really, really fascinating. I also think that the French press, and especially Le Monde has dedicated, since the very beginning of the war, a lot of resources to covering Ukraine. They have a lot of correspondence. And I really appreciate the fact, and this is maybe more of like a French journalism thing, but they have a lot of more magazine-y pieces kind of taking the temperature of society over there.
Soft news.
But like quite long pieces. One person I really, really love to read is Ariane Chemin. She's written recently a piece about what happens to psychiatric wards in Ukraine during the war. I've seen several pieces on war widows. What is their relationship to the state, to the army, to the war? What is their relationship with the rest of society? And all of these things are kind of like a step away from daily news, are not about the day-to-day developments, but really tell you about how a society is coping. And I think they do that very, very, very well. Now that a lot of my reporting is centering human stories in the show and in the long-form narrative series that I do, I think it's really important for me to keep an eye on that. I think the different journalistic traditions really kind of just widen my scope in covering that.
Earlier when we were talking, Adelie, you said something about focusing on the heart and society issues. And I wondered, as a woman, do you feel like you are suggested to take on the softer things? Because I think you could certainly report on diplomacy and the military. And it's something I've found in my career, that there's often been you're a woman, so can you, write the emotional stuff? And I do that really well. I back myself on it, but I can also do the really tough stuff. And I know a lot about the politics and the diplomacy, and I speak to top sources in the military, and I can bring that hard news. It's just something I'm so acutely aware of that people will often just associate what I do with the softer, more emotional side of things. And I do think that is a distinct trait of being a female reporter, and I wondered if you felt the same.
That's a really interesting question. And I think you make a really good point. I've often felt that. And I've often in my career kind of maybe limited myself to that. I think that's true, like being a bit afraid of going for the harder stuff. And that's definitely something that I want to develop now that I am working on a beat that has a lot of hard stuff. And I think you're completely right. And I think it is very much a thing that you get given as a woman. However, I don't think I got given this as a woman. Covering the heart of Ukraine was David's beat, and the way the boys had divided the different areas amongst themselves. And obviously I stepped into co-hosting the show after David. So I've kind of inherited his beat, really.
Yeah. And just to explain to our listeners, you're referring to David Knowles, who is the creator of Ukraine the Latest, as well as Battlelines, our colleague who sadly passed away last September. And you've done a brilliant job of taking on his care for the humanity and the human side of the Ukraine war, which was really a hallmark of his journalism. I want to pick up on something you guys were discussing, and Sophia, I'd love to hear your point of view here. When we talk about hard and soft journalism, our listeners may or may not know that we're referring to, really sharp news, which has a very clear news line. Kemi Badenoch said this, and now she's under fire for this. And it's all sort of fact, quote, quote, quote. And soft news is what we call a drop intro. There's like some nice colourful paragraph of description, and then you slowly get into the story. I wonder if that is a construct that we've sort of built to suggest that hard news is good and soft news is weaker or has less value for some reason, in the same way that we hold up war reporting is really idealised within journalism, I think, and other forms of reporting is seen as less ambitious, less brave. Sophia, what do you think?
I feel like a lot of the work I do fall somewhere in between, because a lot of my stories do have an anecdotal lead, a drop lead, but I look at things like war crimes, human rights abuses, government corruption. So that in itself is very, very, very newsy as a topic. But the investigations I do often are diving into these realms, these like very murky realms. I mean, right now I'm looking at basically a mix of government corruption, the impact of war, why refugees have to leave where they are, if they ever really find a new place that they can call home, and all the black, dark underworld. I mean, the gangs, the criminality that's involved is incredible. And it's not just one crime, not just the illegal migration part, but a lot of these gangs are also involved in drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. It's really dark stuff. So I think it's interesting that there is that distinction and that there still continues to be. I mean, I like to think that what I do is somewhere kind of a mix of both, I guess.
How do you find smuggling is obviously a story that is largely focused around, as you say, these male smugglers based largely in the Middle East. How do you find dealing with that story as a woman? Do you find ever that people are more or less willing to talk to you, or do you think it doesn't make a difference?
It really depends on the context and where they sit on the food chain. So some of the lower level street agents, the ones who would be potentially out there recruiting, like the ones that you might actually see walking around recruiting people, sometimes they can be a little bit more cagey because they're so worried about being caught. Often they're migrants themselves. I found that in the times that I've interviewed very high level, like the kingpin types, the guys who run the whole show. I mean, I've talked to these guys who have a global network. They've got agents even on the US border. They are very different. And some of them feel that they're providing a service. They're very proud of what they do. I mean, they realize what they do is not exactly by the book per se, but they also believe that they're providing a service for people who really need it. You know, for instance, dissidents who would otherwise be killed or very severely persecuted at home in countries like Iran, even Turkey. They think that the more the world is closed off in terms of borders, the more that they've got a business to run. And actually, they do end up making more money in a way because they can charge more when it's harder to cross. It's really interesting. So it depends partly on the context of where they're from and at what level they are. And then you can think of it as like a company. You know, it's like interviewing the CEO of a bank, for instance, is very different than interviewing a bank teller.
We're going to take a little pause there. Coming up after the break, we'll be talking about Trump's impact on everyone's beats.
As many of our listeners know, our beloved colleague and friend David Knowles passed away suddenly last September, aged 32, from an undiagnosed heart condition. As the creator of Ukraine the Latest and Battlelines, many of you were familiar with his voice and passion for covering conflict with a keen sense of humanity. But you may not know that David was a man of many passions: music, theatre, ancient languages, comedy, Warhammer, Napoleonic history, and above all else, cricket. A late starter, he showed the true zeal of the convert and even founded his own team, Larkhill Wanderers CC. Last weekend, the Larkhill Wanderers played a memorial game to fundraise for the British Heart Foundation. Their goal is to raise £6,000 to help fund life-saving research to tackle heart diseases. If you'd like to donate in his memory, please follow the link to the show notes. Thank you in advance for your support.
Welcome back. We're all speaking in the same week that we're marking 100 days of Trump. I'd be really interested to hear about how Trump has changed all of your respective beats. Who wants to kick us off?
I'll go first. I got to go to Washington for the first time, and that was because of Pete Hegseth, the new Defence Secretary, was having a bilat with John Healey. It was fascinating, really, to be in the room with him. Trump's cabinet is made up of such intense characters, and he really took issue with a question one of the other reporters put to him, basically saying, you know, America is just kowtowing to Russia. And he got so animated and said, you know, that's garbage. And he was so defensive on it. It was also interesting to be in the room because this special relationship between the US and the UK, I've been to many a press conference, but they had teapots and cups and saucers and cookies with, you know, like our flag and their flag next to each other. And it was like they were trying to have an afternoon tea come press conference. It was totally bizarre. Then obviously Hegseth has been one of the people involved in these leaked messages revealing how they were going to strike Houthis. And it's just been kind of bonkers, really, to see defence playing out under Trump, and also seeing how the MOD and John Healey, the Defence Secretary, work with someone like Hegseth as his counterpart is very interesting to watch.
We've got the Strategic Defence Review, which we believe is going to come out in a few weeks. I remember speaking to you before Labour was elected, and you were very scathing about Labour's defence plans. You thought they were going to be very wishy-washy.
Yeah, interesting that I said it was wishy-washy, because I still think it is going to be such. I mean, it's late spring now. This should have come out They gave themselves wriggle room because they said the SDR will come out in spring. They didn't say when in spring. But, I mean, we're sat here in a heat wave. It's almost summer. I will have given birth, I think, by the time the SDR comes out. It is just being dragged out. And there's no reason. They could have published it now. There was a Defence Select Committee yesterday with Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, who's the Chief of the Defence Staff. They were talking about the SDR and still no one could put a date on it, just saying, spring, late spring. Well, it's certainly late spring now. So when it comes out, I don't know. But I think it's somewhat worrying, given the geopolitical situation we're in right now, that they aren't being more forthright with this, because the whole point of the SDR was to show how defence is going to be transformed under Labour. Well, Labour have been in government almost a year now, and we still don't exactly know how defence is being transformed, other than the fact that Keir Starmer has got them more money, that they are going to reach 2.5% by 2027, 3% by the end of the decade. But everyone says it's not enough anyway. And I had a front page story a couple of months ago saying, 2.5% won't touch the sides. What are the figures? Like, what does this translate to? What new equipment are we going to see? Are Labour going to reverse troop cuts? How are you going to improve the situation on the ground so that people stop leaving the military? How are you going to entice more people in? How are we going to fight the future war? As Sophia was saying, Ukraine is immediate, but China is the long-term threat. And back in 2021, when we had the original integrated defence review under Ben Wallace, the former defence sec, it was all about the Indo-Pacific tilt. That hasn't gone away. China is still a massive threat. And as Carrier Strike Group has sailed and is making its way towards Japan over the next 8 months, the big question was whether or not they're going to transit through the Taiwan Strait, which would be seen as incredibly antagonistic towards China. That's why this SDR needs to come out, because we need to see also what's the long-term plan. What are we still focusing on the Indo-Pacific tilt? Is that still a priority for our government? They just haven't made their position clear. And there's now a concern that they might, in the next couple of weeks, release a sort of brief essay, as it were, of the SDR, not put in any hard facts and figures, but give an overview, like a soft launch, and then put the actual SDR. This is hearsay, by the way. I haven't stood this up with the MOD.
But even that 2.5% and the ultimate goal of 3%, that feels very expedited by Trump, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And that when I went to Washington with Healey to see this bilat, that was something that Healey was kind of using as a way to promote the Brits. He said, you asked us to stand up and we've delivered. We've pushed up our defence spending to 2.5%. They weren't committing to it before Trump said Europe needs to pull its finger out and take more of the burden of Ukraine and do more on defence. And they were then able to really weaponise it as a way to show strength. But it's still not as much as other countries in Europe spend on defence anyway, so...
Adelie, how has Trump affected? It's a big question. It's a big question. But okay, over the last 3 months, how have you noticed that things have changed?
I think the main change is the amount of news, really. I can't remember exactly, but I think over the last 3 months, ever since he was sworn into office, we have put out 3 emergency podcasts about diplomatic developments that had happened by the end of the afternoon when the day's pod was already coming out. And we keep on having breaking news during the pod, just before, just after. So it's just the amount of monitoring, the amount of how reactive we have to be. And also how something that happens at 11 o'clock in the morning can very well be out of date by 2. Every single day has major diplomatic developments. And we're in very historic times where the ground below us is shifting in terms of who's allied with who and how are we allied with the people we thought we were allied with. Are we still allied with the United States? Maybe, probably. How so? That is shifting. And I think the geopolitical design of the world is very much being redrawn at the moment, and it is laying the groundwork for what will happen what we'll see unfolding over the next decades. It will shape the rest of our lives and the rest of our careers, I think. And Danny, as you said very well, China as well coming into and becoming a diplomatic force and also a military force and a military threat. And how is it aligning? How are the alliances realigning between Russia, China, North Korea, the United States? Because all of that is shifting, and because of the ongoing talks and conversations and rows that are happening left and right, it's just been a very intense 3 months, and it's been a very intense moment to join the team.
Do you think we'll see a peace deal this year?
Well, I think that this year is a crucial part of the question. Obviously, Trump said he would sort that in 24 hours, I think. It's a long 24 hours, but I don't think anyone ever believed that. It seems like there's a lot of talk. There's not a lot of walk. Yes, people are talking, but I've yet to see news that look even in the remotest way promising in terms of Ukraine and Russia being able to agree on something and Russia letting go of something in order to see peace at the horizon. And then the question becomes always, what is peace? And what is freedom, and what is liberation, and what is justice? And a ceasefire, a truce, and stopping the fighting is one thing. Does that lead to a peace? If Ukraine has to let go of its territories in order for there to be peace, is that a long-lasting peace? Is that satisfying? Is that justice? That means that you have territories that remain under occupation. Is that peace for them? So whose peace, I think, is the real question. I think we'll definitely see some interesting developments by the end of the year. That's as far as I can tell you. And I'm aware I'm not giving you much. But I think also some of the elements in the negotiations, one of the projects that I'm starting to work on for a narrative series is looking at kidnapped children by Russia. And that's typically in that space that Sophia, I think, was talking about, which is it soft news? Is it hard news? I mean, it is going to be one of the key stakes of the negotiations, which is why I want to start looking at it from more of a documentary and long-form point of view, because I think the raw voices of the people to whom it's happening are incredibly important and need to be centered. But at the same time, it really taps into the hard news, the negotiations, because this is going to be one of the key elements of what's being agreed on.
Sophia, you're an American living abroad. What's Trump's impact been like on your beat?
I cover, of course, a lot of the authoritarian trends of the world. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, this movement that we've had toward this multipolar world. This is language that China loves to use. And under the first term, we saw it already, the beginning of the dismantling of democracy. And it has, in a very scary way, sped up so much with Trump 2.0. It's not a good look if America, the bastion of democracy, is in shambles, right? It does not look good. And what that does, as we've already seen, in just a few months' time, it's emboldened other strong men around the world. I mean, Trump said before that he really admired Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And just in these last few weeks, there's been a huge domestic political crisis. The mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was arrested, and it sparked the biggest mass nationwide protests in more than a decade. İmamoğlu is still detained. This man was seen as the number one political opponent to Erdogan. So this is something that was covered in global headlines, but not so much attention paid and not as much criticism as it may have otherwise drawn from other countries, because it's coming at a time of so much political turmoil globally. Just yesterday, I saw a headline from China. Beijing denied that a call had taken place between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Trump, which apparently Trump had said it had taken place, that a call had occurred. And this is and in the context of the ongoing U.S.-China trade war, both sides hiking tariffs to over 100%. But what's interesting about this is that China is saying that America is putting out disinformation. And this is at a time where that might actually be true. There might actually be quite a lot of disinformation, and that has already been the case coming from the White House. So this world is changing. The world in which we operate is changing so much. It's very murky. The scales are tipping, and it's unclear where things go from here. And I think that's just been so interesting to observe, this sort of impact that Trump has had around the world. I mean, it's just been so bewildering. The news flow, as Adelie said, it's like been completely nuts. There's just so much going on all the time that you start to miss things because he's doing so much every day. And in the long term, I mean, who really knows what will happen? I think this really will change what the world looks like. You know, this idea that funding cuts would happen, for instance, to Sudan. Well, Sudanese refugees are coming to the UK. In fact, a lot of them are coming for free. I spoke to a bunch of them along the coast of France, in and around Calais. They're stowaways. They're not even paying the smugglers because they don't have the money to pay the smugglers. I mean, there's so many impacts of this from a geopolitical perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, from this question that Danny was talking about. How does the UK handle itself now if the special relationship with the US can't be relied on? What does Europe do? You know, there's so many questions. You know, it's both fascinating as a journalist, but also, I would say, kind of terrifying where we go from here.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned, Sophia, there, and that's the stories that we're missing. I'd love to hear from all three of you a story or a conflict, an issue that you think we should be talking about more.
Something interesting that happened in Turkey, which was that last week there was an earthquake. It was a magnitude 6.2. The context behind this is that Turkey is a place where earthquakes do happen, but Istanbul itself sits on two very fractious fault lines. And about every 250 years, a very devastating quake of over 7 magnitude has hit the city. The last one was in 1766 at that level, and it caused a tsunami. So we're overdue. Istanbul is anyway for a big quake. And this one last week really has shaken everyone. But what's interesting is that because on the day of the quake, everybody went outside to be in a big open space in case of aftershocks. And there have been hundreds of aftershocks. Some of them you can feel, some of them actually at magnitude 4 and 5. So they're not small. But we've got the quake, people in public spaces, and also we're still in this political environment where there were all those protests. There's still boycotts and demonstrations here and there. And so in a lot of the big parks of Istanbul, you see riot police. I mean, people are out trying to enjoy the nice spring weather. They were trying to find safety because of the quakes. Some people were camping outside and still are because of the concern that something might happen overnight. But then you've got riot police. And so that tells you a lot about the political situation here in Turkey. And I do think even though the initial arrest of the Istanbul mayor was covered in his detention, the bigger picture right now is not so well understood. And, you know, I do think it's because there's so much news going on right now.
Covering the Ministry of Defence, there's actually so many stories that I don't get to write about because they're so secretive. It's really difficult to get access. And something that does fascinate me is the new weapons that they're making. Some of the engineering is absolutely extraordinary. And if only we could be granted this access to showcase it, you know, what a message that would send to adversaries to say, look how capable the UK is. Look at, you know, the little money we do have in defence. Look at what we're able to do with it. And to get this access, I can't really go through the MOD. I have to go to, you know, the individual companies and say, let me write about this. So I recently wrote with Anduril, a US-based tech firm that have opened up in the UK, and they do a lot of work with the MOD. And they created this amazing sonar that can sit at the bottom of the sea and track submarines and do it completely quietly, and they will go unmissed. So we're seeing lots of Russian activity near British water. You know, our critical national infrastructure is all below sea level, and there are companies out there creating these secretive devices that can track our adversaries without tipping them off that we're there. Traditionally, sonar is noisy and you can gauge whether something is in the vicinity. So being able to see what waters they're traversing in is amazing. And I only know about this because this company was able to invite me in and talk to me about that piece of kit. And there's such a, I think Sophia talked about it earlier, but like a hostility towards media, towards journalists, governments not trusting them and not thinking how there might be an opportunity to actually work together sometimes, rather than always seeing us as the opposition. You know, we also do want to write about the incredible feats of engineering that are taking place in this country. And I only wish that there was more access to that kind of kit and equipment to really showcase it, and, you know, also give ourselves a pat on the back every so often and say, wow, you know, we created this. We have some of the best scientific engineering minds in the country. And it's a shame that we don't do more to, honour the work that they do.
With the war in Ukraine, I feel like it's opened everyone's eyes on the threat that Russia is and the long-standing history of imperialism and how the West has really reckoned with it in the aftermath of World War II. But more and more so, I'm becoming, very curious, but a lot more aware about we should be paying attention to these border countries to Russia. And obviously they're countries that are either small, like the Baltic countries, not very much talked about, not necessarily strong players on the diplomatic scene, or the stand countries, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Armenia. I'm just more and more aware of Central Asia, the Caucasus. And I just think generally, as we're seeing this invasion in Ukraine, this war continue and drag on, and as we are coming to grasp with Russia as an enemy and as a military force, we should be paying more attention to these countries and starting to look at them now rather than when something happens, and start getting an understanding of what's going on locally now. And obviously, journalism is always in a state of crisis, so we can't create more bureaus. That time has long, long passed. It was way before all of our careers. But I just think we could maybe be a bit more proactive when it comes to the Russian sphere of influence and these border countries.
Before we wrap up, I feel like we just need to quickly hear about what it's like to be a reporter while pregnant and not to be allowed on certain ships by the Ministry of Defence.
I mean, obviously everyone's experience is different, but just as a wider kind of point, it has been interesting for me because I didn't used to think twice about going to Ukraine, putting myself in a dangerous position. And now I am pregnant. It has given me pause for thought because I feel like, I can't be completely selfish now. I have to think about the other person that I'm looking out for. So it's become more of like a moral thing in my mind that I'm trying to weigh up. And also, I'm not ruling out going there again, but I am, heavily pregnant now, so it does limit my options. But I had a difficult time in December because I was invited to Ukraine with the Defence Secretary and I couldn't go because I was so unwell in my first trimester. Any women that have been pregnant listening to this know that the first trimester was absolutely horrific. Yeah, the sympathy nod, like you're just being sick all the time. And I, had so desperately wanted to go, been asking John Healy's people for months, please can I come with him? I want to accompany him when he goes. And I had to turn the trip down because I was too unwell. That was a real bummer for me professionally. But, I had to put my health first and that of my unborn child. And then recently, Carrier Strike Group is the big story happening this year in defence. So that's HMS Prince of Wales, a massive aircraft carrier, £3 billion, will be travelling with a huge escort all the way to the Indo-Pacific and beyond. When you're pregnant, you're not allowed on a vessel at sea. And so when I was recently, I pitched for an interview with the Commodore. I assumed I'd do it in an office or something. And they said, okay, well, you can actually come on board while she's alongside. That was great that I got to go on the ship. It made me laugh that I'm not allowed at sea because I can't, personally, I'm still flying. I don't see why I can't be at sea. But actually, it was quite difficult being on board because it's so gigantic and just getting around the vessel. You're up and down ladders, really steep staircases. And at one point, there was basically just like a vertical ladder that I had to kind of climb up. And my body's obviously changed. My centre of gravity is different. And it was really hard. And I did think, oh, okay, I feel like maybe they had a point and I shouldn't have pushed myself. But I'm also, want to prove that, I can do whatever the boys can do. And actually, maybe biology comes into it. And I'm just going to have to accept that I can't.
I think I can do whatever the boys can do has definitely been a driving philosophy behind most of my career.
Yeah.
And perhaps for all of the women gathered with me here today. Adelie, Sophia, is there anything that you guys want to add?
The only thing I was going to say is when we were talking about you asked if we had a different perspective, or you asked how we might approach things differently. I think the only thing I wanted to add is that I think sometimes as a woman, you can be more disarming than you realize because people don't expect so much, I think. I've definitely experienced that before. And in times when I've done stories about women and children, for instance, with human rights abuses, of course, they will open up to me in a way that they probably wouldn't to a male reporter. And so it can work in your advantage.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And particularly in my time working in the Middle East, you get to interview the women and the men, whereas the men can't go into certain spaces, can't speak to certain people. And that definitely, I think, added a lot of value to my reporting.
I've also worked in the Middle East, and that's definitely been my experience as well. I'm doing an interview later today, the misogyny at the heart of Putin's regime and how that's being used in war crimes in Ukraine and elsewhere. And one of the points that the person I'm interviewing later today makes in her book, that's Sophia Yan on Putin's War on Women, is that not only do we get access to people and to topics that men will not necessarily have access to, but also we know how to spot signs and we know how to ask questions that they would not know to ask, especially when it comes to sexual violence and especially when it comes to discrimination and gendered violence. And I had never thought of that as a woman, my quite, annoying experience of misogyny and gender violence would actually make me more skilled at asking the right questions, at recognizing the shift in someone's gaze, the shift in someone's attitude or body language in order to pick up on that. And I think that's really made me think about how we cover these type of stories and maybe the sort of unlikely and very sad advantage that we've got there.
Thank you so much for joining us on Battle Lines.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Great to talk to you all.
That's all for this episode of Battle Lines. A big thank you to one of our longtime listeners, Mafe Chavar, I really hope I've pronounced that name correctly, who suggested this panel of female Telegraph reporters. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have topics that you'd like us to cover, let us know. You can email us on battlelines@telegraph.co.uk. We'll be back again on Friday. Until then, goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.